I love that. Okay. Welcome, everybody. As somebody mentioned, I'm one half of the Sister Hover Traveling Roadshow. My name's Christina, actually Tabachka. Hover's my main name. I'm here because of my father being a member of this round table, so I am a legacy member, so to speak.
Does that mean they have to take it?
Yeah, they haven't kicked me out yet.
We're working on it.
If we keep up what we're doing.
Okay, just a reminder, if you want to be on our email list to sign up, and there's also a list of all our meetings in the back table, as well as some stuff from the general brought. Before I say anything, I have to say this, that I want to recognize the day it is and recognize all those we lost. I have a special connection to New York. All those we lost 22 years ago, all the first responders who answered the call, and all those we lost, and the veterans of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It obviously changed our world, and it changed a lot of people's lives either that day or in the subsequent 20 years. So, our guest tonight, guys, goes by two identities. I think General Grant doesn't need an introduction because we're probably all familiar with what he did to save our union. However, Dr. Fields, you may not know about him. He joins us from Memphis, Tennessee. He's been an avid and lifelong student of the American Civil War, which led him to portray General Grant. And it was out of his deep respect and admiration that he started doing this. He has portrayed General Grant at the 150th observations of Fort Donelson and Shiloh, Raymond and Vicksburg, and Appomattox, which I think is when I first encountered him. Hang on, sorry. Yeah, he was selected to portray General Grant at the 150th anniversary of Lee's surrender at Appomattox. He has a bachelor's and master's degree in education from the University of Memphis. He later earned a master's degree, this is important, in secondary education and a PhD in educational administration and curriculum from Michigan State University. Okay, well, we won't hold that against him. So he's a career educator, having taught for 8 years at the junior and senior high school levels, then 25 years as a high school administrator, and he teaches as an adjunct sociology professor at the University of Memphis and in education for Belhaven University, Memphis. He is now an educational consultant and living historian. May I present to you General U.S. Grant.
Well, good evening. It is good that we should be able to come together and visit one with the other and learn one from the other. It's also good to be back with old friends whom I have met upon the field and to be particularly so warmly welcome. And speaking of being warmly welcome, I have to tell you, well, first I'll tell you that Julia's not here. And because Julia is not here, I can put my hands in my pockets. Anyone associated with the military will know the last thing you do, in fact, the one thing you don't ever do, is put your hands in your pockets. I always have my hands in my pockets. I am most comfortable that way, and Julia keeps telling me, Liz, take your hands out of your pockets. You're the most unmilitary man I've ever seen. You embarrass me. So she's not here, and I can put my hands in my pockets. When I was sent here, President Johnson called me to the executive mansion from the War Department, and I went in, and he said he Well, you may know President Johnson and I are not on the best of terms. And if you don't, I'll tell you we're not. And he barely looked up from his desk and he said, "You're going to Ann Arbor, Michigan." And I said, "But Mr. President, I'm busy. I'm running the entire United States Army. We're sending soldiers home. We had nearly 3 million soldiers. We're trying to get them off the payroll. I'm trying to send troops out west with our Indian problem. I'm busy. I don't have time to go to Ann Arbor, Michigan." And he said, "You're going to Ann Arbor, Michigan." And I said, "Well, who has got such an influence with you that you should pull me out of my duties and send me there?" And he said, "The Ann Arbor Civil War." As if I should believe him. And I came to believe him, so I got off the cars today. I also would tell you that I am thrilled to be here, and I feel I should explain to you, since I'm talking about military deployment and demeanor, I know better than to stand before you with my hat on my head inside the building. However, I do it to make a point. Ted Bowers, who is a name that you probably don't recognize, Colonel Theodore Bowers. Well, Ted Bowers was on my staff during the last 11 months of the war when I took command of all Union armies on March the 9th of '64 and was with me through the end. That still doesn't sound familiar to you. What will sound familiar to you is General Grant looks as if he could put his head through a brick wall and he's about to do it. Now you know Ted Bowers. He's the young man who wrote that in a letter home to his wife. And he was somewhat embarrassed on that first time rather that we met, and he was assigned to my staff. And because he knew I'd read it in the newspaper, he didn't realize his wife was going to release it to the local papers. Well, he also said, and I assured him I thought it was funny, he also said about me that General Grant always wears his slouch hat low over his eyes, placed squarely upon his head. I never saw him otherwise. So I wanted you to see me, however briefly I might politely demonstrate this before I took off my hat, to see me as my troops see me on a daily basis. Now, being an officer and a gentleman, I will remove my hat. It is good, doubly so, to be back here in this area because you may know I lived in Detroit for off and on for a couple of years, 49 through 51. Lived at 203 or 503 East 4th Street between Russell and Brevard. And I wrote Julia a letter. I found it and told her I'd gotten it. Now, as any man dealing with a woman knows, happy wife, happy life. And I had to get it without her knowledge. So I wrote her a letter and I said, it's got downstairs, it has a double parlor, a kitchen, a bedroom, and another room. Upstairs, there's ample room, and out back, there is a wonderful garden with lots of fruits for you, because she likes to can and do those things. She wrote in a letter home that she said it was a very sweet house. I don't know if that was a compliment or not. That may be wife speak, for I don't like this place, but that's what she told her parents. It's a very sweet house. But it was over on 4th Street between Russell and Brevard. I do have an anecdote about that. As you know, all of you well know, it gets snowy and icy here in Michigan. Well, in January of 51, I was walking home. And the owner of the house that I was renting on 4th Street, one Zachariah Chandler, who was at that time mayor of Detroit, owned the home. City ordinance, and I certainly hope it's still in effect, you should check and be sure, required that owners keep the front of their homes free of snow and ice. Well, there was ice on my stoop as I walked to my front door, and I slipped on the ice, feet overhead, and came down and twisted my left knee. And to this day, it still hurts me. Well, being in the cavalry, and or rather the infantry, and spending a lot of time on a horse, I was out of commission for several weeks. Well, I sued. Yes, sir. I took him to court. Now, he was disdainful. Now, I didn't have an attorney. I defended myself to apply my suit. And I complained about the ice and the snow, upon which I slipped and injured my knee. And Mayor Chandler came back and said, well, if you soldiers didn't spend so much time drinking, maybe you'd be able to keep your footing on the going up to your front door. Well, that didn't sit well with the judge, and he found in my favor. I was very pleased. I had that, well, take that feeling. Mayor Chandler, I guess you'll clean your snow and ice up now. And he was fined, or I was awarded 6 cents. Yes, sir, I got 6 cents. Mayor Chandler was fined $8 for court costs. So I won 6 cents suing Mayor Chandler. And I think they're talking about him replacing Cass as the United States Senator. Mayor Chandler, they have a future in Michigan politics. I don't know it. I can't see into the future. But let's talk about Lee, Robert E. Lee, and me. Now, I've got some documents that I brought with me that I need to emphasize for you. Now, we're going to start because you probably never heard it. I'm going to start with giving you the terms of surrender that I wrote for General Lee. And they say, General R.E. Lee, commanding C.S. Army. General, in accordance with the substance of my letter to you the 8th instant, that means this month, instant means this month, I propose to receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia on the following terms, to wit. Now this couple of sentences is a bit dry. Rolls of all the officers and men to be made in duplicate, one copy to be given to an officer to be designated by me, the other to be retained by such officer or officers as you may designate. The officers to give their individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. And each company or regimental commander sign a like parole for the men of their commands. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked, and that was in the field immediately in front of the McLean house. If you've ever been there or you have not been there and you go, when you're standing on the front porch of the McLean house, right across that lane is a large open field to this day. And that's where I had all of the artillery and wagons and wheeled vehicles parked and turned over to the officers appointed by me to receive them. This is what I want to emphasize with you. This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes. Hear me. This done, each officer and man and Lee had about 28,500 troops with him at Appomattox. So this is addressing an army of 30,000 men. Each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authority, so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside. Very respectfully, U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Now that's 188 words. Now Lee's acceptance, which I will not read to you, there's no need to do that, was 57 words. So the two documents that essentially ended our terrible Civil War is less than 250 words. But let's go back to this. Officers may retain their sidearms. Now, why did I do that? And that plays into what happened with General Lee. I took a great deal of criticism because I was told, well, you let a bunch of rebs loose in the countryside with guns. Are you out of your mind? No. They are honorable men. They're honorable men. And if they say that they're not going to fight anymore, they're not going to fight anymore. But I wasn't thinking about pistols. I was thinking specifically about their swords. Now, a sword for an officer serves several functions. It's not really a weapon. In fact, the gentleman officers only sharpened the first 12 inches of the blade, from the point down 12 or 18 inches. The rest of the blade, to be sure, could be sharp, but the saber was not meant to be so much a weapon as it was, first of all, a big finger. Because when the gunfire starts, black powder generates deep, thick, white smoke. And they're very loud. And when you've got tens of thousands of men on each side in combat, once that first shot is fired, there's no such thing anymore of a vocal command. Soldiers in combat are led by drums, bugles, flags, and an officer's saber. Now with flags, rally around the flag, boys. So many people don't realize that that's not just a ditty and a song. That was serious business. The color bearer had a most serious job because the color bearer was to stay next to the officer or who was in command and knew what he was doing, and in combat that changed frequently. But the color bearer would bear the flag and point it in the direction the troops are to go. So when you're fighting, you look above that smoke and that flag is pointing yonder direction, your first thought is get next to the flag, get in line of battle, and go in the direction the flag is pointing. Rally round the flag, boys. That's not just a verse, it's serious business. The other two, bugles and drums, most of you are civilians only familiar with charge. Now I'm tone deaf. I'm profoundly tone deaf. All music is noise to me, but I recognize the bugle calls. There are some 57 different bugle calls, and each one of them means something different. So you're listening to that bugle, and particularly if it says retreat. But the drums also have some 50, I think there are 58 different drum beats, and each one of them represents something else. What you're familiar with the drums is the long roll, the assembly. When those drummers start beating that long, steady roll, It's battle stations. Everybody runs and takes his place in line because something important is happening and everybody is required to be present. So we got drums, we got bugles, we got flags, but when that officer raises that saber, he's pointing which way to go. So you follow that big finger which way to go. But an officer's saber is his symbol of authority. Enlisted men don't carry swords. Officers carry swords. So when I let them keep their sidearms, I let them keep their pride. I knew that there were going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of mantles all across the South with a sword proudly hanging over the fireplace. But my feeling was, let them have their pride. Not one, because of what I wrote, not one Confederate officer, not one, had to yield his sword before the conquering Yankee to break the symbol of authority over his knee. There was no need to add unnecessary insult to already grievous injury. Let them keep their pride. So the healing, in at least that one sense, there are several others, began in the parlor at the McLean house. But that's why I let them keep their sidearms. Now, General Lee had a particular sword with him that was given to him by a doctor in Baltimore, Maryland, imported from France. It was jeweled with diamonds, sapphires, I'm told, diamonds, sapphires, and rubies. I didn't see it. I saw the scabbard because General Lee came to the McLean house in a brand new uniform that had never been worn. He had it in his van with him. Never been worn. Given to him in cadet gray, which is a gray, something like, it's a blue, something like this man's jacket here. It's a almost blue, but not quite. And he had a white shirt on. And I still marvel to this day, as I sat there across that parlor from him looking at him, I thought, where in the world did you find something so white here at this time of the war in April the 9th of 1865? Never worn the shirt rather. It's the only time I would point out to you that Robert E. Lee wore the rank of general. If you look at the pictures and photographs, you will see him with the three. The Confederates wore their rank on their collars. We kept the old Army on our shoulders. Confederate rank on the collar. The 3 stars on the collar are rank of Confederate colonel. That's the rank that Lee wore the entire war, even though he held the rank of general. But when you're a general officer, you may dress as you please. So he always wore the rank of colonel, except at the surrender. The only time he ever wore the rank of general. And that's the same 3 stars with a wreath around them. There are no photographs of him wearing that. He took off the coat is still in Appomattox. The family gave the coat. But he never wore it any other time. And it's the only time that the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia were ever in the same room at the same time. But General Lee had brought his sword, thinking he was going to have to give it to me. Now, I should like to disenfranchise you with the pure romance that he offered me his sword, and I declined. That's bunkum. He never mentioned, to my great relief, he never mentioned that sword. And I was sitting across the parlor looking at him, desperately hoping, I will tell you, do not bring up the sword, because I don't want to have to decline it and turn it down. So the sword, in actuality, was never mentioned. And I was greatly relieved. So if somebody says, well, General Grant turned down his sword, no, General Grant didn't do that. The sword was never offered to General Grant. But he said, when he was asked by his staff, why are you putting on that uniform, that dress uniform, and carrying that sword? And he said, well, because I may be General Grant's prisoner, and I must be dressed appropriately. And you took that jeweled sword, which was never taken out. He had it with him. He did not carry it in the field. In fact, like myself, he never carried a sword with him. I haven't worn a sword since Shiloh. Well, the key here for you to remember is where it said, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authorities so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they reside. So what we've got is the only time in history when a civil war ended and the opposing side, the rebelling side, all went home. Not one Confederate soldier from Robert E. Lee right on down went to a prison camp. And let me repeat that. Not one Confederate officer or soldier upon Lee's surrender, which did not end the war. Essentially, it ended the war. But there were some 15 surrenders after Lee. The last one being Stan Wadey in Dokesville, Oklahoma. And he surrendered the last fighting force in the field. A fellow in Houston, Texas surrendered that morning, and Wadey surrendered that afternoon. They're still fighting over who was the last man in the field. But we had 30,000 Confederates. Every one of them went home. Nobody went to a prison camp. Nobody was executed. Nobody was hanged. This has never happened in history where the rebelling side of a civil war, when the war is over and they're defeated, they went home. To stay home as long as they obeyed the laws, not to be disturbed by the United States government. Well, then we gave them all paroles. There were some 5,000 or 6,000 cavalry under, I think, Fitzhugh Lee, not one of Lee's sons, one of his nephews. They had, they were accused of having skedaddled, but they had not. They had fought the day before on the 8th and acquitted themselves well. In fact, I wrote later on about it that the scraps and the fights that were held in those last few days, the 7 days from April the 2nd when Lee evacuated Petersburg and Appomattox to the 9th, indeed the morning of April the 9th, there was a pitched fight there at Appomattox Courthouse, pitched battle. In those 7 days, I said, I wrote that I had seen some of the hardest fighting and courageous acts on the part of the enemy that had been demonstrated throughout the war. So those 28,500, 30,000 Confederate soldiers that were with Lee at Appomattox, they were your hardcore fight to the end Confederates, which explains why I was so muddy and filthy. I had a private's blouse on, which is a short blouse coat. My wore out muddy trousers stuffed in my boots. I didn't have any spurs. I didn't have hat cords on to indicate my rank. I didn't expect the Lee to surrender that quickly. And I was absolutely filthy. I haven't bathed by the time I met Lee on the 9th. I had not bathed in 6 days. I hadn't changed my clothes, no, not even my underclothing, in 6 days. My hair was so filthy, it looked like it was painted to my head. I was absolutely filthy. When I got the note that morning at 11:50, when Lieutenant Harry Pease came riding across that ground there at Walker's Church, 8 miles from Appomattox, when they finally found me, and that's for another evening together. I'd like to tell you all that, what happened those last 2 days. I had a decision to make. Lee had surrendered. Now, he'd been at Appomattox for 2 days, and he had his personal van with him, thus the new uniform. I had left Meade in the Army of the Potomac. Meade was in bed in an Army ambulance with severe intestinal, the runs, dysentery, and was a bed. In fact, being carried in an Army ambulance. And see, I'm criticized because you didn't have Meade with you. You don't like Meade. You had Sheridan, he's your boy. I heard people would say this where I could hear it. Well, no, I didn't leave Meade to be with my favorite, although Sheridan is a favorite. But Meade was sick, and Sheridan had taken the Army of the Shenandoah around south and west and east, and General Ord, EOC Ord, in command. So they had stopped Lee. Sheridan on the 8th had said, I wish you were with me. Well, that's all it took from me. So I and my staff of 12 rode to be with Sheridan to be at the end. That's why Meade was not with me at Appomattox. And I was sitting on that rock at Walker's Church, Virginia, which is still an active congregation to this day. And I wrote my reply to General Lee, and I had a decision to make. Now, I knew that I was filthy. I was beyond filthy. I was abhorrent in my appearance and my personal, I suspect I was very aromatic, but then all of us were. So I felt I wasn't alone there. But I knew the moment. I knew what was happening. Lee wants to meet me to surrender. The war is going to be over. And I look like I just crawled out of a mud hole. I do not look appropriate for the occasion. My decision that I had to make was, do I send troops in yonder direction, several of them, to find my van? I have no idea where it is. It's back there somewhere. Hadn't seen it in 2 days. And bring me a uniform that's appropriate to meet with General Lee. Or do I go as I am and meet General Lee? Well, I've already made, I think, 3 references to 30,000 Confederate soldiers being at Appomattox. There's about 50,000 from the Army of the Potomac and about 50,000 from the Army of the Shenandoah, and they've got them in a vice grip. And these are the men who are the true stalwarts. And they're looking at Yankees here and looking at Yankees there, and they're both saying, if you want some more fight, Yankee, you come ahead, because we got plenty of fight for you. And I knew too that the man, in the 7 days going up to the surrender, I saw something I'd never seen. Not a single shirker. Nobody sitting on the side of the road with his brogans off, rubbing his feet. Nobody out walking through fields, picking apples off of trees or getting corn that's too green. No, sir. Everybody was in the ranks. They were going across fields. It was a blue flood with about 80,000 soldiers in pursuit of Lee. Nobody wanted to be the last man killed. But nobody, none of them, wanted to miss the end. There were no stragglers. Never seen that before in all of my Army career since my days at the academy. So they're all there, and they're looking across yonder way at the Confederates, because the area around the Appomattox Courthouse has kind of in a little valley, a little bowl. And I knew that with 100,000 plus men, and every one of them armed, every one of them a hardened combat veteran who has inured to killing. One more bullet, one more rib, one more yank ain't gonna bother me none. And all it would take would be for one fool to see somebody on the other side and fire a shot at him, or one individual to be messing with his weapon and it goes off, or somebody drops a weapon. These pistols are notorious about discharging when they fall. And one shot and the slaughter would begin, and the blood would be ankle deep. And I didn't want to wait to let that happen. So I wrote General Lee, I'll meet you at a place and time of your choosing. And even in that defeat, I gave him the courtesy. I told the surrendering general, I will meet you at a place and time of your choosing. I extended that courtesy to General Lee. And it was not accidental that I did so. So we got on our horses and we were 8 miles away and we were thundering through that Virginia mud. And I'm in the middle of 12 men on horseback, and I got even more mud on me. I had to just about wipe my eyes out to go into the parlor, in McLean's parlor. So General Lee surrendered. And I don't mean to say dismissively, so General Lee surrendered. He did surrender. And he was, I think, more than a bit surprised when I let them keep their horses. Two facets about the horses. Rufus Ingalls, my quartermaster, said, don't you take their horses. We don't want them. Because they're wore out, they're broke down, and we don't want to have to care for them, and we don't have enough forage for our own horses. So we don't want their horses. The other facet is, as I told General Lee, it's early in the spring still, they've got time to get in a crop, take their horses home. So all you've got to do is say, it's my horse. Nothing else, no other challenge we've made. Is this your animal? Yes, it is. So all the cavalry, all the wagon, the teamsters, all the artillery, they just unharnessed their animals and took their artillery wagons, horses rather, so I let them take their horses home. Well, some time goes by, and General Lee and everybody went home. President Lincoln heartily approved of my message. Congress approved of it. There was hurrah and halloa all over the country. The cruel war is over. Let them go home. Now, I have given terms to General Lee that if you go home and mind your business, you will not be disturbed in your person or your property by the United States government, and signed that document. The president's approved of it. Well, President Johnson is not so like-minded.
General, your time is up.
My time grows short, I see. Thank you, Colonel. Be seated. It's good to find good staff. On May the 29th, now April 9th was a surrender. May 29th, President Johnson issued a proclamation of amnesty, but he had some limitations to it. Actually, he had 14 exceptions. And he's not even an attorney, he's a tailor. But I thought some of you might think to get a laugh out of that. He exempted, however, former Confederate government officials, officers with the rank of colonel and above. Now, he had granted amnesty to all people in the South that had rebelled against the Union, with 14 exceptions. And one of them is, if you were in the Army, colonel or above, or lieutenant or above in the Navy. Okay, well that would fit General Lee, wouldn't it? Also, if you, people owing or owning more than $20,000 in property had to negotiate individually. And everybody else had to ask for an individual pardon. Now, some of the exceptions were all who have been military or naval officers of said pretended Confederate government above rank of colonel or lieutenant. Well, that would fit General Lee. That was your third exception. The fifth, all who resigned or tendered resignations of their commissions in the Army or the Navy of the United States to evade duty in resisting the rebellion. Well, that would fit General Lee, wouldn't it? Because he was actually offered command of the United States Armies. If you didn't know that, he was offered command of the United States Armies in 61 and declined. Also, another exception, all military and naval officers in the rebel service who were educated by the government in the military academy at West Point of the United States Military Academy. Well, there's another one. General Lee was a graduate of the class of 1825 at the United States Military Academy, so they had to apply individually. Now, that was May 29th of 1865. Johnson, President Johnson, we're not on good terms, but he is the president. President Johnson didn't hold so well with that. And he was already perpendicular with Congress because of their approach to Reconstruction and his approach to Reconstruction. Both were terrible, guaranteed to exacerbate the wounds and rip open the scars that were beginning to form. And I didn't hold with either one of them. But he had a federal grand jury in Norfolk, Virginia. Now, Admiral Porter told me how to pronounce that. It's Norfolk. N-A-F-A-W-K, or N-A-F-O-K, Norfolk. It's not Norfolk. If you say that, they'll say, you're not from around here, are you? But in Norfolk, in Virginia, federal judge John C. Underwood issued an indictment. Now, it was brought up by attorneys defending General Lee et al., other officers, but he signed the surrender with General Grant. I just read you the terms of that. Were they not clear? If you go home and obey the laws where you reside, you don't take up arms again against the government of the United States, you will not be disturbed in your person or your property. That's clear. But the judge, when that argument was raised, the federal judge convening the grand jury said this to the grand jury. In his charge to the grand jury, Judge Underwood, in his wisdom, said this: to an inquiry which has been made by an officer of the court, whether the terms of parole agreed upon with General Lee were any protection to those taking the parole. Were they any protection? It ended the war, but were they any protection to those taking the parole? The answer is that this was a mere military arrangement and can have no influence upon civil rights or the status of the persons interested. Now, the parole, the terms of surrender that I signed, that General Lee agreed to and he signed in his agreement, is dismissed. It's relegated to the trash heap with the disdainful terminology, a mere military arrangement, and can have no influence upon the civil rights or the status of the persons involved. I was outraged. It doesn't take Solon to figure out that that is a travesty of justice. It's the civil courts reaching over into the military. As you can tell now, I was outraged. I would have none of it. And on June the 13th Of course, it wasn't, the grand jury may be secret, but the indictment was not. On June 13th, at the War Department, I received this letter from General Lee. And General Lee writes, upon reading the President's proclamation of the 29th ultimo last month, or the month before last, ultimo. Now, you know, I've read you 3 of the 14 exceptions, but General Lee fit them all. Now, he had to apply as an individual. Upon reading the President's proclamation of the 29th ultimo, well, and I also should say, you can imagine my surprise at getting a letter from General Lee. I kept the stamp. I came to Richmond to ascertain what was proper or required of me to do. Now, this is Robert E. Lee writing this to Ulysses S. Grant. When I learned that with others, Longstreet, and right on down, starting with Lee's staff right on down, I was to be indicted for treason by the grand jury at Norfolk. I had supposed that the officers and men of the Army of Northern Virginia were, by the terms of their surrender, protected by the U.S. government from molestation, so long as they conform to its conditions. I am ready to meet any charges that may be preferred against me, and do not wish to avoid trial. He welcomed the trial in many ways. But if I am correct as to the protection granted by my parole and am not to be prosecuted, I desire to comply with the provisions of the President's proclamation and therefore enclose the required application, which I request in that event may be acted on. Well, I heard, you know, Washington's like a sieve with information. I had heard that something was afoot like this. And as I've already said 2 or 3 times, President Johnson and I were not on the best of terms. This did not help that situation. Well, I immediately passed on General Lee's letter to Secretary of War Stanton. That's one of those things that you don't keep that very long. You pass it right on up to the next fellow. And added these endorsements on the back. Being excluded from the provisions of amnesty and pardon contained in the proclamation of the 29th ultimo, I hereby apply, this is General Lee's letter, for the benefits and full restoration of all rights and privileges extended to those included in its terms. I graduated at the Military Academy at West Point in June of 1829. I said earlier class of 25 was class of 29. Resigned from the U.S. Army April 61, was a general in the Confederate Army, and included in the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia 9 April 65. You see, it's important, he said I was included in that. Well, then I endorsed that and sent it on to Secretary of War Stanton, saying, respectfully forwarded through the Secretary of War to His Excellency the President with the earnest recommendation that this application of General R.E. Lee for amnesty and pardon may be granted him. The oath of allegiance required by the recent order of the President to accompany applications does not accompany this for the reason, as I am informed by General Ord, EOC Ord, Edward Oath of Cresap Ord. The order requiring it had not reached Richmond when it had been forwarded. So General Lee had not gotten the requirement that you have the oath of office, or the oath of allegiance to the United States. Secretary of War Stanton wrote on the back, below my endorsement, presented by the Secretary of War and postponed for further consideration in Cabinet. Postponed. Now, you know, Secretary of War Stanton's a pretty sharp fellow. he's the fellow that came up with the insanity plea for defense. Did you know that? Secretary Edwin M. Stanton is the first man to try a case and got him off, or had him declared innocent under the temporary insanity plea. So, because a fellow shot another, Dan Sickles, thank you. Dan Sickles shot a man dead. The nephew of Francis Scott Key, the son of Francis Scott Key, Star Spangled Banner. Well, Mr. Key was dallying with Dan Sickles' wife and making no secret of it. So Sickles said, if I see you, sir, I will shoot you dead. And he saw him, and he shot him dead on the streets of Washington.
Right in front of the White House.
Right in front of the White House. How dared he? And Stanton, Secretary Stanton, conjured up temporary insanity, and General Sickles lived to fight another day. So Stanton's pretty shrewd. Now, at that point, I went to the executive mansion, and President Johnson and I had a brief but intense conversation. I will spare you the details of what I said or what he said, but I will tell you the content of the conversation. I told the President of the United States, angrily told the President of the United States, I pounded the desk with the letter from General Lee and asked him, what insanity is this? What madness is this? What madness is this? I gave General Lee my word as an Army officer that if he went home and obeyed the laws of where he resided and did not take arms again against the government of the United States, that he would not be disturbed. And now there's a federal indictment for his arrest, which will most assuredly result in a kangaroo court and hanging for treason. No, sir. Now, you trading politicians, you may do whatever it is that you do for whatever reason you do it. But I am a soldier, and I gave this man my word as a soldier. If he obeyed his part of the deal, he would not be disturbed. If you persist in this madness, I will resign my commission from the United States Army right here and right now, or at such time as you refuse to drop this matter. And I said the same thing at a cabinet meeting, and angrily left both meetings. Now, President Johnson did not want that to happen. He badly wanted to hang Lee. Specifically mentioned hanging Lee on several occasions, and other Confederate officers and Confederate Congress, on and on ad nauseum. But President Johnson also knew that my resignation would wreck his presidency. Now, it is not for me to indulge in braggadocio. What I have been to the country is not for me to say. It's for you to say. It is for you to determine my import in our country and our history. Not for me to opine. But many have said that my resignation would have been the end of President Johnson's administration and whatever he had wanted to do. I was the most powerful man in the country and the most popular man in the world. And my resignation would have rocked Johnson's administration to its very foundations, and it would have crumbled around those foundations. And Johnson knew that. So he did not pursue the matter. Not then. Now, on June the 20th, 7 days after General Lee's letter, I wrote this letter to General Lee. General, your communications of date the 13th instant stating the steps you had taken after reading the President's proclamation of the 29th ultimo with the view of complying with its provisions has come to my hand. When you learned that with others you were to be indicted for treason by the grand jury at Norfolk, that you had supposed the officers and men of the Army of Northern Virginia were by the terms of their surrender protected by the United States government from molestation so long as they conform to its conditions. That you were ready to meet any charges that might be referred against you and did not wish to avoid trial. But that if you were correct as to the protection granted by your parole and were not to be prosecuted, you desire to avail yourself of the President's amnesty proclamation. And in closing an application, therefore, with the request that in that event it be acted on, has been received and forwarded to the Secretary of War with the following opinion endorsed by me. In my opinion, the officers and men paroled at Appomattox Courthouse and since, upon the same terms given to Lee, cannot be tried for treason so long as they observe the terms of their parole. This is my understanding. Good faith, as well as true policy, indicates that we should observe the conditions of that convention. Bad faith on the part of the government or a construction of that convention subjecting the officers to trial for treason would produce a feeling of insecurity in the minds of all the paroled officers and men. If so disposed, they might even regard such an infraction of terms by the government as an entire release from all obligations on their part. I will state, well, when you think about it, if the government's issuing indictments, then they're ignoring the conditions of the convention. Then those Confederate soldiers would say, well, if you're going to do it, we're going to do it. And what?
They're not qualified.
They're not, if you're doing what you're doing, we are no longer bound by that convention. And where would that have led? Guerrilla warfare. But to continue, I will state further that the terms granted by me met with the hearty approval of the President at the time and of the country generally. The action of Judge Underwood in Norfolk has already had an injurious effect. You can imagine the grumbling that was going on all over the South. And I would ask that he be ordered to quash all indictments found against paroled prisoners of war and to desist from further prosecution of them. This opinion, I am informed, is substantially the same as that entertained by the government. I have forwarded your application for amnesty and pardon to the President with the following endorsement thereon. Respectfully forwarded through the Secretary of War to the President with the earnest recommendation that this application of General R.E. Lee for amnesty and pardon may be granted to him. The oath of allegiance required by recent order of the President to accompany applications does not accompany this for the reason, see, I had to address that. There was no oath of allegiance to the country. But Lee didn't have that oath of allegiance requirement when he got the general statement of amnesty, so that's why it did not. I did not want a legal technicality to hang up this process. As I am informed by General Ord, the order requiring it had not reached Richmond when this was forwarded. Very respectfully, U.S. Grant, so forth and so on. And that was the end of the matter. That was the end of the matter, for the most part.
Were you a member of Wallace?
Yes. Now, having said everything I have said to you this night, let me be emphatic. I placed my entire life and career on the desk of the President of the United States. And I angrily told him, if you do not cease and desist and drop this matter, I am going to resign. I was Lieutenant General of the first one since Washington. I'm credited with winning the war, although I did nothing. Those soldiers did it all. But I will resign here and now if you do not stop the prosecution of General Robert E. Lee and everyone else included in that indictment, or anyone else it might include. Because I was thinking, once the dam breaks, it will inundate everything in its path. There will be, once that Pandora's box is open, there will be no closing. And I did that for Robert E. Lee. Not because I loved the man so much, but because, as I most emphatically stated earlier, I'm a soldier. I gave him my word. I gave him and every other Confederate soldier in the so-called Confederacy, obey the laws of the country and don't take up arms again, and you will not be disturbed. Let the fighting, let the killing stop, and do not resurrect the anger and the pain and the grief. Do not start another civil war, because, Mr. President, that's exactly what you are about to do. That's exactly what Robert E. Lee told Jefferson Davis. No, we're not going into the hills and fight man for man. There will be no controlling men under those circumstances, and it will lead to naught but vicious bloodshed until the last day. But if you do this, you are going to unleash the dogs of war, and there will be no calling them back. And I will stake my reputation on that opinion. And he didn't pursue it. However, let me look a little bit into the future. The indictment of General Robert E. Lee was not formally dropped until February the 15th of 1869. I took office 3 weeks later as President of the United States. Like I said, I'm slipping time a bit. On June the 20th, the same day that I wrote General Lee my lengthy and heartfelt statement, Attorney General James Speed instructed the U.S. District Attorney at Norfolk not to arrest any paroled officers or soldiers. And that ends the saga of what I did for General Lee. Now, I would like to point out to you also, I have written since, well, there are two things I'll take solemn oath with you, all of you here this night. There are two things that I will never do. Never ever do. Run for office. Write a book. Never do it. All those other fellows are piling up the books one on top of the other. I'm not going to get involved in that fracas. Now, having said all of that, I can at this point, if with your permission, bring it to a close and entertain questions and answers.